had sort of seen the direction things were going, and there was a counter-reaction quite quickly and quite forcefully. The Saudis in particular very quickly got in trying to work the system out and try to make sure things worked out to their own advantage. They were, and this is an ironic point, the Saudis were actually very, very angry at Washington at that point after Mubarak fell. The Saudis felt like Washington had betrayed them and betrayed their man in Egypt. But the curious thing about it was Washington, in and of itself, really hadn't. They stuck with Mubarak until the very last moment. They were trying to work Omar Suleiman, the vice president, in. They were very much trying to preserve the regime in Egypt in some fashion that could still be workable for them. At the end of the day, they couldn't, and now Washington was trying to pretend they were with the revolution all along, which was not the case at all, nor was it in Tunisia. Again, Washington was very much caught off guard, but the Saudis Riyadh very much took offense to this and felt like the U.S. should have been saying, go in, guns blazing, like Tiananmen Square, which just happened in Syria now, it was not happening in Egypt at that point. But that really woke the Saudis up, and they decided they were going to try to work this to their own advantage. Now, the comparisons are often made to the Berlin Wall and the fall of communism. What's happened here, there was a very different issue. When the Berlin Wall fell, you had a clear alternative model available for Eastern Europe. You had governmental structures which, varying degrees of quality, that in many cases were able to be reworked. In the Middle East, you don't have any of those conditions, really. There is no clear ideological path once the regimes are gone. The protesters were largely, they were angry at the way things were, but they didn't have a clear political program. Now, what allowed them to succeed in Egypt and Tunisia, to a lesser extent in other locations, was the fact that there was this channeling of extreme anger over the conditions that the Middle East had wound up in over the prior few decades. And then from that, they were able to essentially organize in leaderless fashion. There was no single figure that could be co-opted, as the regimes were used to doing. So by doing this, they were able to knock the dictators off. But they were reacting to decades of stagnation, politically and economically in the region. In the 50s and 60s, when the regimes, ultimately the dust settled, the regimes sort of consolidated themselves, you had a situation where they turned, first and foremost, on the economic side, to which was called ISI, import substitution industrialization, yes. Basically trying to make their countries self-sufficient on an economic basis. But it was married with the fact that you had essentially, you had very strong crony relationships set up in the economy. They nationalized many of the industries, most of them in most cases, and then the idea was that you were going to create domestic self-sufficiency in the economy. What you got instead was a series of highly inefficient, basically incapable industries, capital misallocated, and that turned into essentially no job opportunities. What replaced it was Gulf oil money. Now, in a place like Saudi Arabia, that was direct, and throughout the Gulf, it was simply subsidies you buy the population off. Population is quiet, we give you a decent standard of living, and a few people get very, very rich off of that. But if you look to places like Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, into North Africa as well, what you had instead was labor being exported to those regions. So it provided a means whereby all the unemployed, who basically could not realize any sort of economic gain in improving their standard of living, were able to go to the Gulf, and then their families back home got remittances, the cash was sent back. So that provided a way to sort of paper things over for a very, very long time. So that continued to work for quite a while, but it's hit its limits. There's only so much so far that can go. The other clear divide that works alongside that, not perfectly, but in many cases, is the divide between monarchies and republics in the region. Now, the Arab republics, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Algeria, all of these states essentially had set themselves up as the voice of the masses for people in the Arab decolonization. So they gave lip service to democracy, they gave lip service to socialism, and socialism was implemented certainly to a large degree, but it was completely failed socialism. So they gave lip service to all these things, and then increasingly as time went on as well to Islamist slogans, even though they were very much secular. But What had happened, though, was simply that they turned themselves into dictatorships. They weren't able to meet people's needs. What they were able to do was, again, attract rents, money from the Gulf states and from the Western powers, and prior to that, as well, some of the Soviet powers, the Soviet power. So, again, there was this ability to get beyond the fact that the republics were not living up to their stated ideals. The monarchies, on the other hand, were very straightforward in their system and style of rule. So whereas the republics sort of promised false social justice, the monarchies didn't have any pretension to that. They simply basically declared themselves a traditional form of rule, and essentially abandoned social and democratic ideals, except for the notion of we have to meet our people's needs. We have this sort of mandate from tradition, but we need to basically just keep people happy, and that's the only requirement that they had. So as the uprisings moved along, many of the monarchies sensed this as an opportunity to undermine even the remaining ideals of the republics. They had tolerated them for a long time because as they consolidated their power in the republics, they became increasingly dependent on Gulf oil money. So they were able to essentially, the Gulf monarchies were able to turn those states into their local clients. So it was their job to keep people in line, essentially, especially the larger population countries in the region. So that was taken and utilized to their advantage, but as the Arab uprisings came, it became very clear to Riyadh and other of the Gulf monarchies that these dictators were no longer keeping the people in line for them. So the question became, okay, what do we do? How do we react to this? And there was a brief period there of uncertainty with the first two uprisings, but also when calls kind of went out in Saudi Arabia as well. And the Saudis, after sort of what they call it the day of rage had passed and nothing had happened from it, they breathed a huge sigh of relief. A lot of people were like, this won't happen. Many others were feeling it would. Nobody could guess at this time. Oil markets were very much on edge. What's going to happen? Is there going to be anything happening on that day? I was sort of, every Friday in particular, I had all the Arabic news feeds on at work trying to see, okay, what's happened today? Where's things going? And nobody really knew. But the second it flopped, there was this huge sigh of relief out of the Gulf, certainly from oil markets as well. And the Saudis at that point could feel very, very confident in moving forward. So at that point, they had decided, okay, our clients in these Arab republics are no longer reliable. So we're going to be very, very happy throwing these guys under the bus, getting rid of them. If we can keep them, if they continue to do their job for us, sure, that'd be great. So in Yemen, they would have preferred to keep Ali Abdullah Saleh in place, but when it was clear that he couldn't do it, they were perfectly happy to jettison him. However, then the next step is, okay, how do they then create new clients, new systems to control what comes into place? In Yemen, this has been a very clear case of the Gulf basically trying to ensure that Saleh's own family and his own power base and tribal power bases as well stay in power. And that it was brokered by the GCC, it was also brokered by Washington. So there was no real pretense here of trying to sustain democracy from the Saudi side. Washington's rhetoric certainly said so, but the reality of the power politics made it clear that was not what was happening. Another side to this as well is that the Saudis and the Qataris as well, who are in very public competition with the Saudis in many ways, even where they cooperate in others, is that they realized as many of these states broke down, they could go into the power gap and, again, be able to find new allies, and in particular, sort of very conservative allies. You could say the Muslim Brotherhood or the Salafists in various Islamist streams, but also promoting the sectarianism they always had as a divide and conquer sort of strategy. Washington has played along with that fully. That pattern has a long history, but most prominent with the invasion of Iraq. While there certainly have been many ethnic sectarian tensions in many of these states for going back a very, very long time, one of the few things that many of these republics did was at least give lip service to the notion of a unitary state, citizenship, common identity. Now, they often did this while simultaneously promoting the differences and then saying, we're the only ones who can hold this thing together. But the notion was at least there, and even their broader secularism and the ideas of socialism and democracy were failed, there was a strong growing notion of common citizenship in these places. And Iraq has slowly broke down, as Saddam tried to clean the power throughout the wars and then throughout the sanctions era, but it was still there. And the minute the U.S. Army showed up, the first thing they did was say, you're a Kurd, you're a Sunni, you're a Shia, give us your representatives. Now the state is no longer a unitary state. Now you are known by your sectarian identity. So Washington has played this game very well. The Saudis like to play it up. The Iranians and Iraq in particular played it up very strongly. So you get this atomizing of the population as they go into different identities as the central state breaks down. In many ways, the failure of the central state was the failure of ISI. It was the failure of ability to provide opportunities to people. So that continued to break down. But now the Saudis and the Iranians, to a lesser extent, the Israelis quietly on the side, though that's been a very long strategy of theirs as well, to give sectarian identities to their benefit. But the Saudis really taking the lead on this and being able to play up those sectarian identities. But as well, very much simply pushing to empower Islamists wherever possible as well. So that's why you have the Qataris, who were very heavily involved in arming the Libyan opposition. You have the Qataris out in front saying that the Syrian opposition should be armed. And in Syria, you have it in certain places like Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood has very much become sort of a status quo power over many, many decades. In Syria, the Muslim Brotherhood was crushed in the 1980s, went into exile, and remained probably one of the most violent and extremist segments of the Muslim Brotherhood in the region. And these are the sorts of groups that the Qataris and Saudis want to arm. And I'm sure at this point are quietly arming in the background as well. Again, creating new clients, creating them on a sectarian basis, against they can be manipulated and work to their advantage, and use that to make sure that they have people on their side. So the Saudis have certainly gotten more comfortable with their role. Taking part in the crushing of the uprising in Bahrain was a big part of that as well. That is Saudi backdoor. There's even talk now of the monarchy and some of sort of the minority Sunni sectarian elements of the regime there, playing up the notion of some sort of federation there. At least de jure, it's been de facto for a very long time. But that gave the Saudis a great deal of confidence. Morocco simply never saw as large a protest movement. It's certainly been there, and it's had its impact. There were at least surface changes to the constitution made as a result, but it hasn't moved as far. Jordan is not seen as having been quite as bad. They've been cushioned by Gulf and U.S. cash and alliances and weapons, but there is actually rising tension in Jordan that does not get much attention in the Western press or the Arab media, which is largely Gulf-owned anyways. So these are the monarchies and how they've played things out. It is interesting as well that Jordan and Morocco have been, I'm not sure if it's a formal invitation at this point, but they've been invited to join the Gulf Cooperation Council, which basically tells you it's not about the Gulf, it's simply about monarchies. So those are the alliances that are being formed. What's the U.S. role in all this as the Saudis in particular have really found their feet? As far as most people in the region are concerned, this series of events has basically shown that the U.S. is a naked manipulator. They'll come out and they'll talk freedom and democracy where their enemies are concerned, look at Syria in particular, look at Libya, but the minute their own allies are under fire, suddenly it's, we can talk this through, or complete silence, right? So Yemen was a clear case that. Bahrain stands out as probably the starkest example. U.S. Fifth Fleet is based there. Strong alliance with the Saudis and their backdoor, so nothing was about to be said there. Anything that was said was behind closed doors, and certainly nowhere near strong enough to shut this down. The role of Bahrain as a strategic ally was simply seen as too strong for the U.S., so they refused to do this. And they actually continued to provide arms to Bahrain in the face of the ongoing crackdown, which hasn't stopped yet. They continue to support the Yemeni military. In Yemen, the question is simply, will we have Yemeni special forces who will continue to go and whack al-Qaeda guys, and can we continue to fire drones into Yemen? And as long as that happens, the U.S., like the Saudis in Yemen, they're having to choose the element they want to support, but they're mostly old regime forces who very much remain not completely in power after the GCC deal, but definitely in the lead, in the front seat. It's certainly not safe to say that the system is overthrown. Again, the U.S. was seen as having supported Mubarak and Ben Ali right up to the last minute. So basically at this point they're seen as very much involved with the Saudis and others in a counter-revolutionary role. I would say it's actually more complex than that. It's more a case of Washington being torn by different interests and different tendencies they've had over the years. Washington was certainly taken by surprise. U.S. foreign policy, as always, is torn between the notions of, righteous, light to the world, all this sort of thing. We bring freedom and democracy, but at the same time, pure power politics, desire to protect interests in the Middle East. Interests basically being, passionate, three basic interests for the U.S. in the Middle East. You had the Cold War struggle when the Soviet Union out. You had safeguarding oil out of the Gulf, and you had Israel. And when the Cold War ended, the focus on the Gulf oil and on Israel intensified, right? It grew ever stronger. And that's the situation we have here today. No backing down from that. This is where a lot of the one-sided nature of U.S. involvement is seen. But Washington winds up torn between the two. Do we defend our traditional interests that we've seen, or do we defend the notion of democracy, and try to hew this middle way, which ends up pleasing nobody and ends up betraying quite a few people. In other cases, take Syria as an example. Your more restricted Western policy in general is more restricted in what they can do there, and there's a recognition of that. And Washington is actually stepping back a bit, whereas the Gulf powers are pressing forward more with arms. But as far as most people in the region are concerned, this is not seen as having improved the United States image in any way for the eyes of most. Another key issue that's come about as a result of this is obviously the rise of the Islamists throughout the region on many different levels. In Egypt, it's probably been brought most clearly to the fore. The Muslim Brotherhood very quickly took a leading role in filling the power vacuum as the protests managed to move forward. During the uprising itself, the Muslim Brotherhood was very much trying to cut a deal with the regime. They saw an opportunity to basically bring themselves into the legitimate power structures of the state. And they couldn't quite convince themselves that Mubarak was going to fall, so they thought, let's take advantage of this. There was a clear division within the Muslim Brotherhood, many divisions that have occurred since. Generically speaking, between an older generation and a younger generation. The younger generation was out on the streets. The older generation was trying to cut deals. But again, this goes to the fact that many of these Islamists have become integrated into the system and status quo powers in many ways. The other side of the spectrum in Egypt is the Salafists, these ultra-conservative Islamists, who traditionally shunned participation in politics, but have definitely had a huge turnaround, and won a sizable minority in recent Egyptian elections. I think it was something in the order of 5% versus 40% for the Muslim Brotherhood. And they had the advantage of the elections arranged by the military of having been very complex, not having had a lot of time to prepare. They had a grassroots network on the ground. They were identifiable, very much similar to the Muslim Brotherhood, so they rose to power. But also if you look at Syria, the Muslim Brotherhood, very much a leading force in the Syrian National Council opposition group. And then you have increasing numbers of sort of radical jihadists as well coming in and filling that group. So you have all these different strains of Islamists. The ones that are more integrated in the region, things like the Ennahda Party, which won a plurality in Tunisia, they're very much, they've experienced repression over decades. They've experienced the revulsion that's come from many in their own populations. The Algerian example really stands out. You had the Islamic Salvation Front, which was poised to take power. Instead, the election canceled, and they were repressed. You had a decade of civil war, tens of thousands dead. So people are realizing they need to step back a bit. They need to make sure they don't look too scary to the West. They need to make sure for elements in their own society who find them too conservative that they can step back a bit. They can focus on the fact that they have relatively clean reputations and they can govern well. So that's where their focus tends to be. But then pulled to the right. This is very much, if you think about like the Republican Party today. You have a centrist, modest right, pulled very, very hard to the far right by the Tea Party and groups like that. You can kind of think of it in the same vein. Muslim Brotherhood are sort of the centrist Republicans, and the Salafists are the far right Republicans. So similar dynamic, even if very different circumstances. So you have the Islamists, you have the militaries, which have gained a lot of power in this as power brokers. You have the old elites who are far from gone in many of these states. They've been weakened, but they have a lot of resources. both in terms of political links and in terms of assets, in terms as well of cash, both inside and outside of their countries. So these three powers, if you think about it, the old regimes, the militaries, and the Islamists now are the ones going to the fore. The revolutionaries who knocked the regimes off had their day but weren't organized, and so, as is often the case, the gap is being filled by the existing organized forces. And those forces are not the forces that were there in the 50s and 60s, the socialists, the communists, the Arab nationalists. They've largely been discredited. There is a rising sense of Arab nationalism again. People often talk about the death of Arab nationalism. I think it's come to the fore in a greater sense again. It's definitely not the leading trend, but it's taking on a new form. A sense of common identity, especially as the uprisings that spread from country to country. That said, where's things going to go from here? It's a difficult call, obviously. What I would say is the problem you have is a lack of clear ideology, especially given that a lot of the uprisings that have occurred were at core about a lack of social justice. They were at core about a lack of opportunity in life and the ability to move oneself forward. So what you need is an ability to move the economies of these countries forward. But the uprising in itself damages the economy further. It creates a desire for order, and it creates a desire for some form of program that gets people's lives back on track, feel like they're moving forward. If you look at many of the movements that have launched the uprisings, many of these were leftist movements, very disorganized again in many cases. They're the ones who in many senses are most calling for people's rights, whether it be labor rights, freedom of speech, all the standard sort of human rights. But they have a program that essentially calls for renationalization of industries, continued, deeper socialism. The socialism didn't work right the first time because it wasn't implemented, this sort of thing. So it's a program that's not going to get anyone anywhere economically. On the other hand, if you look at sort of Washington consensus liberalization, it's been completely discredited over the past couple of decades because it just led to crony capitalism. A few people getting rich while the rest stagnated. So, I have a lot more detail to go into, but maybe one thing, and I'll just finish up on and open it up for some questions and talk. I got a request to talk a bit about Iran too, which I understand is a little bit of interest in. Certainly, from my perch in the oil markets, it's an issue now of primary concern. If you look at rising oil prices and rising gasoline prices over, say, the past 6 to 12 months, you can basically attribute all the rise to what's been going on with oil, virtually everything in the market. There's not been a clear fundamental direction. There has been certainly some impact from improving macroeconomic markets, equity markets, the whole risk-on, risk-off trade. That certainly helped it, but for oil and its outperformance over these asset classes, it's all about intentions. If we speak structurally over time, we have entered a world where even though we've had a lot of demand destruction since 2008 on the oil side, we've got a lot of supply issues that have come to the fore. The world is much shorter on oil supply. There are certainly some things that are changing there, but what's happened is Saudi Arabia has been left as essentially the only state in the world with spare oil production capacity. If there's a demand surge, if there's a supply outage somewhere, it's pretty much only the Saudis who fill the gap. And they have a very historically thin cushion versus the past. So when you start talking up potential conflict in Iran, you start putting on unilateral sanctions that you apply to other states as well, and you get a situation where Iran might actually, even short of a conflict, have to shut in oil production because it simply cannot find buyers. The Saudis are the only ones who can step into the gap there. And if you head to a point where you've got actual conflict in the Gulf, and you potentially shut off 2.5 million barrels, about more like 2 million barrels a day of Iranian exports, the Saudis basically at that point have to ramp up to full production capacity, and there is zero cushion left at that point. And that's the worry, is that that will happen, and that as a result of that, the oil markets get very jittery. You price in these forward expectations, or at least certain odds that they can happen when the odds are rising, and the oil price goes up. It could actually be worse. You could have a situation where Iran decides they could strike at southern Iraqi production. The feeder lines for the export ports there have been bombed 2 or 3 times in the last few months. They're very, very vulnerable, and the Iranians have huge influence in Iraq. So you've got this potential risk sitting out there. People are very, very worried about it in the oil markets, and it's very rational to worry about it. Because what's happening is you have a case where you're sliding, I think, into inevitable conflict. You have Washington and Tehran, who are both basically extremely overconfident in the hand of the plan. Washington is convinced that that they will need to understand force, right? You have to push them to the brink, and eventually they'll back down, right? And this is the same foreign policy establishment that essentially works in Democratic and Republican administrations. The two golden rules of Middle East policy and domestic U.S. politics are: one, you can never say enough good about Israel; two, you can never say enough bad about Iran. And everything has come together on this issue, right? So the domestic politics are driving this. The strategic vision is driving it. More broadly in U.S. policy, and the domestic politics, especially in an election year, in a very heated election year, are driving it even further. I mean, if you look at just the election campaign in general, this is a point where Obama has arguably been extremely hawkish. He's pushing the line very, very hard, and yet you have Romney saying, you threw the Israelis under the bus, the Iranians are going to get a nuclear bomb if Obama's reelected. But in reality, they're all going to run pretty much the same policy. One may be a little more aggressive than the other, but they're all heading essentially the same direction. Now, if with Bush and the Iraq War, you essentially had a premeditated desire to deliberately start an unjustified war, with Obama and the situation we're having here is you have a set of policies where he is willing to let us slide through them, right? There's no fresh thinking that says this entire issue is off base, right? The entire problem here is much bigger. The Iranians want nukes because the Israelis have nukes, but you cannot mention that the Israelis have nukes. Those are good nukes, right? The Iranian nukes are bad nukes. So this becomes the issue. You cannot get out of that cycle. And at the same time, you believe Tehran will back down. So you push, and you ratchet up the pressure. And there's, I think, a lack of full acknowledgement, certainly from the sources I've spoken with, of how serious it is when you start touching Iranian oil exports. They're ratcheting it up one step at a time, but at this point, if you're Iran, I mean, you probably feel like Japan in the late 30s and early 40s, when all of a sudden their access to energy was completely cut off. Well, what do? You start doing crazy things, right? At the same time, too, you've got drones flying over you. You've got a scientist being assassinated left and right. From Iran's perspective, these are acts of war. From the U.S. perspective, it's steady ratcheting up of the pressure, right? But if you're Iran, you're not going to look at it that way. At the same time, if you're Iran, you're looking around to how things have moved in Iraq over the past decade. You're looking at Afghanistan. And in Tehran, they're feeling like we basically beat the Americans in each of these places, right? They came in fighting hard. We played a subtle game in the background, and we won. The Americans are leaving these places, and our allies are the ones who are in the strongest position as a result. So they feel very confident. They feel like the domestic arms industry they've developed, they feel like they've got a very strong core of supporters. Even if you could argue, and I don't know enough about Iran to say that there is a majority of people who don't care for the existing system, you have a very, very solid minority who is strongly behind it and very, very nationalistic, and very much behind the regime and the system as it exists. So you've got a strong power base to make an argument that you know how to resist the Americans if they come and pick a fight. So they're not going to back down. And this is what happens. At the same time, you've got all sorts of arms flittering around the Gulf right now. And at some point, my personal view is that this is probably towards the end of this year, but obviously it's very, very hard to predict. At some point, somebody's going to let off a volley of fire, and it's going to get worse from that point. You're going to have, I think, an accidental slide. Now, whether that means a full-fledged war, bombing campaigns, I would tend to think it probably means just a long series of skirmishes. If you remember the tanker wars in the 80s in the Gulf, probably sort of a tanker war on steroids. Some serious shooting off and on, many incidences, and trying to poke each other in vulnerable points. But enough to get, again, oil markets very, very worried, which is an issue that then winds up tanking the economy and threatening to throw us into a double-dip recession as a result. Meanwhile, Iran's watching the U.S. and feeling like, okay, this is a wounded giant. The U.S. is in decline. While they overestimate their own influence, talk about how they supposedly inspired the Arab uprisings. They're about the only ones who believe that. Feeling very overconfident. But then if you look to the east, everybody is looking, the Iranians are looking to China and feeling like, okay, this is the rising power. If you're China in this situation, though, you're sitting back and looking and saying, you've got the world on fire economically here. And yet you have the Americans and the Europeans basically playing with fire with a third-rate power, and worried about them and talking about this third-rate power as if they were a threat to world peace. And it feels like for the Chinese, it's like, Americans, why are you playing in the sandbox with the kids? You know, there's much bigger issues at play here. So the strategic issue there is this just feeds into the decline of American power. There's simply no strategic vision in Washington for where the country is going to go. And that works on many levels. It's not just an overstretched military. It's the fact that we have an economy that's been juiced up for 60 years on monetary policy and cheap money. We've long since lost our competitive advantages in many arenas. Productivity gains are, again, have mostly been about building on this cheap money. Sure, there's been some real productivity gains in many areas, but strategically, we're flat, where the Chinese and Asia broadly are managing to move themselves up, or Brazil as well. So without the strategic vision, the power slides, and there's simply nothing stopping powers in the East from rising, or in BRICS generally. And so if you're Iran, you're watching all this, and you feel very, very confident in your position, even though you're not acknowledging properly the power that the United States holds. So you wind up in a situation where things slide into the end of the conflict. So that is some of my views. Maybe I could do some discussion.
Well, let me ask you a U.S. foreign policy question first. A couple of days ago, the New York Times wrote an op-ed piece where the author was essentially arguing, given the United States is relatively low and in fact declining dependency on Middle Eastern oil, that our tepid conservative response to the revolutions there had more to do with protecting some of our allies who are heavily dependent, Japan, South Korea, and others. What's your take on that?
No, actually, it's a very interesting point, because one of the analysts who I work with at PSC is probably one of the best sort of Middle Eastern geostrategic analysts I know, was making this point to me several months ago that he's seeing the first signs of this. He called it the tip of the spear among policymakers, that we have had a real revolution in energy production in the U.S. You asked 2 years ago if we were going to have the kind of increased production we've had since. Nobody saw it coming, right? There were a few signs, but when you talk fracking for gas and all the associated liquids that come with that, it's a huge change in the strategic vector for the country. And it's going to continue for a decade or more. We're going to become one of the largest rising energy producers in the world as far as delta changes to go. And the possibility of genuine energy independence is finally there. Okay? So that means something very significant as far as we're going to get cheaper energy. We're going to get to the point where higher energy costs actually can become a net benefit to us. We solve a lot of our current account deficit. We bring back manufacturing. We'll be producing our own steel again. You have all these midstream industries that will come back. And that completely changes our strategic vision. I don't think, in the face of the era of uprisings, that was the consideration yet. I think all the old considerations were still there. Again, the Cold War ended, so you took away one of those three pillars, but you still have the vision of the Gulf energy issue that's still being an American protectorate, and you have the Israel issue. So you take those two together, and I think those are the ones still driving policy. If you were very, very concerned about Japan and Asian allies, you wouldn't be forcing them to cut back on Iranian crude. So I think a lot is changing there as a result of that. I think that's going to be a serious strategic change in policy. The interesting thing will be, as the Gulf energy issue backs off as a strategic pillar, what does that do to policy regarding Israel and Palestinians? So the other thing too is, what does that do to the Gulf monarchies and all the allies there? The Gulf monarchies can turn to their alternative customers. They already are. U.S. or imports of Saudi and Gulf crude in general are at lows. The Saudis for years and years said, we want, as a strategic issue, we want to be the #1 source of crude oil imports from the U.S. They backed off of that a few years ago. It just didn't make sense to them anymore. They were giving up a premium in Asia. U.S. demand wasn't there, and that's only increasing now. Every once in a while, they'll give a surge for reasons. So right now, the White House is extremely concerned about high oil prices. They're trying to think of all sorts of measures. The Saudis are trying to soothe them. So there was a report after, typically they send 1 or 2, they're called VLCCs, 2 million barrel tankers to the U.S. They send one every month or two to the U.S. They just booked 11 of them in 1 month. So they're trying to show, we're your reliable ally in this front. But that's declining, and they are very much looking to the east. They've got joint venture refineries in China. Those are their customers. The U.S. strategically, the Gulf is tying up more and more with China.
So just going back to your discussion about the uprisings and revolutions throughout throughout North Africa and the Middle East, kind of sounds like from your description, you know, the U.S. approach to that was somewhat kind of, we were caught on the back foot, so to speak. You know, our approach to it was somewhat muddled. Now, obviously, it was a very kind of complicated position for the U.S. to be in. Obviously, you know, trying to protect old interests, but then kind of seeing the writing on the wall, so to speak, and seeing where things are going. So, I guess kind of asking you to kind of maybe go out on what would have been the ideal approach, what would have been a better approach, and going forward, what should the U.S. do?
I'm always of the opinion silence is golden. You know, you speak softly and carry a big stick, and what you should have been doing was, and this is tough for the U.S. obviously. You know, you're seen as the leading power globally and very much in the region, so what do you do? If I were, you know, pulling all the strings behind the scenes, I'll just say you stay quiet, you say a few reassuring words here and there, but you put heavy pressure on the regimes in the background. You have all sorts of levers you can pull with them, and those are the things you do, just as a generic response.
I guess bouncing off what you said in the front, and then what you said, you kind of spoke briefly about the military and how U.S. relations are with our allies in the Middle East, and kind of ignoring obvious issues that they do. Do you believe that the U.S. in essence is continuing to arm, I guess, future enemies and just kind of leading to future conflicts? And one reason why I ask this is I was with the land area over in Bahrain, and we were training the VDF over there on just various things, and we're sitting here going, this is totally going to bite us in the butt within 15, 20 years. Why are we giving them our arms? Why are we training these people? Because they're with us now, but we have no idea what's going to happen more or less 4 months down the road, more or less like 10 years down the road. So do you feel like we're kind of, the way what happened with Iran and Iraq, we're just kind of repeating things over and over and over?
The short answer is yes. The more complicated answer is obviously depends on how the power structure shift. I mean, some of these guys will remain in power, or new configurations will come into place, or some of the guys you've armed and trained will still be on your side in a sort of a power politics sense.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, you're flooding the region with arms. We have for a very, very long time, but now they're out in the open being utilized, right? So I mean, the short answer is yes. You're going to bring up We've had decades standing behind this bad U.S. foreign policy. You've got a lot of players who are willing to cooperate with the U.S., but who also sense the U.S. is in a state of withdrawal from the region, and yet clings tightly to some things which are seen as not nice issues. So let's just, I mean, the Palestinian issue stands at the center of them all, but again, what we've seen is that stretches across issues. So again, if you look at the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood and groups like this, you look at Iraq, what happened there, and how Qaeda and Mesopotamia then moves into Syria and then moves into all these other areas. So who will land on their feet? Hard to say. But some of these people, yeah, there's definitely going to be blowback. We've already seen this.
Yeah, I have two questions. So, how does Turkey fit in the picture in this? Because in one hand, you have them looking for becoming members of the European Union, but they're not being accepted as part of the European Union. And then you have, you know, the government obviously openly criticizing the Syrian regime and in the one hand aligned with the Western world in terms of, you know, fighting against the regime. And then how does Russia fit in the picture? While you hear news about them sending warships to the coastal areas of Syria, and what do you think the role of Turkey in this case?
And Turkey's had a very, very interesting foreign policy aspect, in particular, as it's become more clear that the EU is not ready to let them in. They very much see themselves as being able to link what are essentially the old areas of the Ottoman Empire and into Central Asia as well. Seeing themselves as a power broker themselves and not having to be, you know, somebody else's client. All on the back of successful industrialization, economic growth. And a lot of that came from very conservative regions of Central Anatolia, so it was more conservative powers, and that's why you've had The Islamists, very moderate reforms in power as well. So when they look around, yes, they've been increasing their power throughout the Middle East, increasing their trade links, increasing their diplomatic clout and how they play in many of these places. Many times trying to play both sides. So Libya, they started out sort of telling the Western powers back off, right? When it became clear things were turning, and they'd angered a lot of people sort of in the opposition in Libya, they turned around and provided very material support. So Syria is a little bit tougher because it's right there on their border. The Syrians could start, playing up Kurdish issues again. I mean, you might remember Abdullah Öcalan had a lot of support from the Syrians once upon a time, and they finally turned them over to the Turks. So the Turks have to worry about that as well. And this is, I think, a very tricky spot for the Turks, because all of a sudden, you can't tell which regimes are going to survive and which are not. And Syria on your doorstep is one of the trickiest ones of all. So again, they're trying to play both ends. This could really destroy a lot of Turkish credibility, or again, they could come out on top. I don't have a strong opinion of where they're going to come out in this. As far as the Russians, I think that's been very interesting, because how they look at their near abroad. I mean, we saw that in Georgia a few years ago. It's sort of the way the U.S. used to look at Latin America. This is our sphere of influence, and we're gonna control this thing. Syria stands in this sort of gray zone for them. It's far enough away. It's clearly not like Georgia, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, but you had a lot of Syrians who over the years were being educated in the Soviet Union, you had very strong trade links, and you have the base of Tartus, which becomes, Russia one of their major remaining overseas bases, and having had strong links with the regime as well. So they become, again, they're kind of caught in the middle. They've been very willing to openly support the Assad regime to date in many ways, but not to 100% extent. So they're trying to, if Turkey's really playing both sides of things, the Russians are playing more like an 80-20 game, right? They're pushing it very hard to support the regime, but at a certain point they break and say, look, I can't defend you guys anymore. You better come up with some sort of solution here. The Iranians are the ones who are much stronger. They've been sending arms directly to the regime all through this. But this is a dangerous time for the Turks in particular.
Two questions, if I may. The first one, with all this geopolitical complexity, I'm curious how that influences stockholders' business and the decisions you're making in order to maximize profits. We heard recently Ray Dalio at Bridgewater said, he's the biggest hedge fund in the world because he's only wrong 40% of the time. And I think Jim O'Neill at Goldman said something about how hard it was to predict oil markets, and I think he has a PhD related to it. So can you just speak to, how difficult is it really for a big company like Statoil to feel that we have confidence in the decisions we're making?
Yeah, it's a tough one. We got ourselves involved in Iraq in one of those southern concessions, and we're just pulling out of it. It's not enough our interest for the oil. These are tough, unpredictable situations to go into. Look at ExxonMobil too. They get involved in the southern concessions. And then, I know some people who were pretty close to what Exxon was doing there. I don't know if you saw this, they then went and got involved with the KRG and signing deals in the Kurdish region, which just ticked off the central government to no end, and essentially looks like they just got bad advice, right? So it becomes very, very difficult to play in these arenas. Now, most of the oil-producing arenas have pretty well-established policies for companies going in that aren't changing a lot. So if you look at Libya, traditionally, they always had a very diverse set of foreign companies they brought in and worked with. And that's not going to change. What you will probably get is a few contracts shifting here and there. If you look at Iraq, they've established a policy now of bringing in and cutting these deals. Where they've actually, on one sense, been very, very smart. They get all the companies that are bidding to cut their own throats, giving them the lowest possible profit margin. But then that starts to backfire, because then people wonder, is this really worth it? Yes, I'm getting volume, but I'm not really getting the price I want. And by the way, the security situation remains horrendous. So if you're a large multinational trying to work in the region of these areas, you have a certain amount of continuity in policies, but then you marry it with all the conflict that's around it, and it does become very, very difficult to know how to operate. Again, Iran's a classic example of that. Everybody's pulled out. One step at a time. They are the few left, but it's got all that interest. Pulled out as many of those, partially related to the sanctions. But yeah, the oil industry as a whole is used to having to play with high risk, high geopolitical risk in general. It's a particularly hot season, but structurally, people need the barrels. They're looking around for it, they're looking how they replace their reserves. If something's on offer, people are gonna go in. It's just the amount of risk you have to take. And if it's very, very high risk, you get the minnows and small companies and independents going in. Once there's a bit of stability, which might have been brought about in part by those independents going in, then the larger guys start to come in.
Sorry, and then I had part two, I forgot. This has nothing to do with anything we talked about. I'm just curious about your international experience of living in lots of different countries, and you know, Norway is sort of seen as the polar opposite of what New York is in terms of work culture. Can you just speak to what's it like being an American working in Norway versus what it was like working in New York?
Yeah, no, it's, New York, I was kind of the shy timid guy trying to keep up, and there I'm just, I'm a raging bull. Yeah. I got my performance review, and I got a 5 out of 5 for my professional performance, and a 3 out of 5 for behavior. I told him I wasn't going to change it either, so. So, I mean, it is much more laid back, and it varies from place to place. The Danes have a pretty actually aggressive business culture. Swedes, somewhere in the middle. The Norwegians are seen by others Scandinavian, just kind of the lazy ones. And Stavanger, where I live, is kind of seen as lazy by the people in Oslo. So, yeah, they're very big on work-life balance, and I like it because for me personally, I can push hard and I can do the extra work where I want to, but when I don't want to, I can lay back a bit. So, spend more time with family and things like that. There's nice. Anyway.
I was just curious where Israel stands within this whole conflict, and if there is any way, that they could help mediate the situation that is going on in the Middle East, or at this point, are they really in this position of protecting themselves?
Israel's in no position to mediate. They've probably been smart in mostly keeping silent for their own interests. They're not a bucket of water you pour in a fire, they're a can of gasoline. So they have to play it very, very carefully. But with Iran, they are very much the ones who are pushing hard to move faster and faster. And this is actually interesting where Romney and the Republicans say Obama's thrown the Israelis under the bus. Again, in power, Romney or maybe Santorum, these guys would have to dial it back. They know this. This always happens, Every presidential candidate says, I'll move the embassy to Jerusalem, things like this. And again, the power of the reality of causing them to back off. So when we're talking about Iran here, the Israelis, though, are pushing very, very hard. They're using every string they've got with AIPAC and Congress and all their lobbying issues to try to push the administration to move harder and faster. And that's actually created some tension with the Obama administration, who are trying to say, look, guys, we're on your side. We're ultimately doing what you want. Do not push us this far. And by the way, you better back off on this, attacking on your own stuff. So there's some clear tensions there. But the Israelis in this one are very much pushing the issue. The issue is not about some mortal threat from Iranian nukes. The Saudis don't believe that. The Israelis don't believe that. They know that. It's about strategic position, right? You box the Israelis in if you have those nukes. You box the Saudis in. So that you have a strategic counterweight, right? Strategically in the region, this is a big part of the problem. We have almost all the power in the hands of the Israelis, the Americans, and the Saudis with their pile of cash, right? And there's no counterweight. In the 50s and 60s, you had the counterweight of the Arab nationalists. Gamal Abdel Nasser. This was a serious, serious challenge. I mean, part of the reason that Egypt and Syria lost the '67 war was because Nasser's army had been bleeding in Yemen for years. They'd sent in and intervened there. That was essentially a proxy war between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, right? So there was a real strategic challenge there. Now you don't have that. Right? You've got the power all lined up in one place, and the fear is the Iranians then could change that strategic balance very, very strongly within the nuclear limit. And if you're thinking from the perspective of the average person in the Middle East, I think, as far as anybody thinks about these issues anyways, it's the Israeli possession of nuclear weapons as well as the solid backing of the United States, which has essentially allowed 6 decades of civilian massacres. They can strike when they want, as hard as they want. They can kill as many civilians as they want in the process, and there are no strategic consequences. And that's the issue that's really at play. Not that the Iranians are angels, not by any means, but it changes the strategic balance completely if that happens. And that's the fear. Wait, did you guys say something already?
No.
Okay.
To the novice, like I am, the perception is that Islam has a much firmer, impact on these disparate governments all throughout the Middle East than you would say Judeo-Christian influences. Even though we're founded on that, our constitution, whatnot. Asia, you don't see Buddhism really, controlling what Mao Zedong thinks and says and how they set up a government there. Latin America, again with the Christians. But in the Middle East, you see, at least my perception is a real stronghold in how governments run and operate based off of this culture of Islam. Why is that? And has the recent sort of Arab Spring moved that pendulum or momentum in any way?
All right. I think we're going to need to do a 6-month.
I was going to say, that's right. I realize that.
Look, it comes back. It comes back to 100 points I'm going to throw out on this. Yeah, obviously, there's a long history there, right? And you could take it back to the rise of Islam and the Crusades and all these sorts of things that have created this tension. But at the core, I think what it's really about is the inability of the region to be able to industrialize, develop economies, normal economies, not rentier economies. And as a result of that, again, this feeling of stagnation. This is an interesting thing. When I talk to a lot of my friends in the Middle East, sort of grown up and tried to find their place in life, there's this incredible feeling of there's nothing I can do. My life is stagnant, right? Unless you're in sort of the upper crust, upper middle class to the rich, which is a much thinner group of people there. You just feel like there's nothing you can do. If you try to do anything, they knock you down, right? Whether that's through corruption, bureaucracy, bribes, the inability to be able to move yourself forward. Life, your education means nothing at the end of the day. You feel so stuck. And when that happens, you come back to identity politics, right? And it becomes very, very important who you are, not necessarily what you're doing in life. And that's not to say that that's not true of everyone to some extent, but it's multiplied and enhanced by the fact that you don't have opportunities in life. And that goes back to the fact that you have these rentier economies. You don't have normal economies and normal ability to develop your life. And that goes back to the fact that, again, you have oil, you have strategic rents, and you've got a history of colonialism, all of which meant that people have no control over their life. Governments have not been representative because of these things, and everybody feels stuck. It's like you have this hand of God reaching down and smacking you down every time you try to. And then as a result of that, religion comes in and fills the gap in a very strong way, more than in most societies out there. An attempt at a response.
My question is probably more related to domestic energy production, and you kind of talked a little bit about this earlier, but I'm quite curious to know, how incentives play for energy producing companies here in America, and just the incentives they have compared with like environmental groups. So when we say, hey, our environmental or our energy production is increasing, at what point, or what incentives does an energy company, Exxon, or I'm not very familiar with this, I'm very novice. At what point are they incentivized, to build refineries and to explore more oil, to dig and do all those things? And is it environmental groups that are doing that, or is it because of the instability in the market and there has to be certain prices, or is it that they like to play a game as well because they're making money as oil prices go up, and as they increase production possibly domestically, they put more supply, the prices go down, so it's almost like they don't have an incentive to try to increase the supply in the market?
You were saying earlier that we've developed a situation where we've got this very tight, very small cushion of spare oil production capacity in the world. And that's been a combination of the rise of Asian demand, but also these supply problems that have occurred. There's been, if you go back at least until recently, every single decade, for several decades now, we have used more oil than we have to start globally, right? And so the market steadily has tightened and tightened to the point where prices have risen. And there's many, many issues behind it. That's a key structural issue. But they say, there's no better cure for high prices than high prices, right? So as that's happened, people have gone into areas that were more difficult to find oil in, and new technologies are developed. Now, I am actually a believer in the long term in peak oil and the fact that, it's a finite resource. But high prices will help you keep digging to find if there's anything else still there. And that's what's happened in the US, is the high prices help people experiment, and they found these new technologies and ways to get a natural gas and an oil alongside of it, and that's what's caused this sort of revolution in US natural gas and oil production. The high prices did it. And if you are an oil company, a multinational oil company right now, almost, I would say globally, your best opportunity, the place where you get the most dollars back for every barrel produced, is the United States. Right? The fiscal terms are very, very lean. In most countries, they basically say, look, this is an economic rent. You're making way more money from this than it costs you to input it in. So there's very, very large taxes in those countries. In the US, it's very, very light taxation. So if you're an energy company, yes, you want to be able to produce in the US and get as many barrels as you can out of the ground in the US. If that answers.
Yeah, I'm quite curious to know if like environmental groups also have, like.
Actually, I was talking about this today, and this is an interesting thing, is that the political culture around this has changed. I think it's largely due to the fact that this has happened in a period of recession, right? I think the environmental groups, if we would have discovered these new technologies, these new hydrocarbons, even 5 years ago, right? I think the political picture and the role of environmental groups would have been much bigger. And you would have at least slowed things down a lot, maybe shut down a lot of this, right? When the economy's good, people don't worry about it. But because the economy is so bad, and this does generate jobs, I mean, you're completely changing the economies of many of the Great Plains states at this point, right? You go to North Dakota, I mean, the money is sloshing around at this point, right? And it's starting to show up in Pennsylvania, upstate New York, places like this. There's a lot of money being tossed around as a result. Not everywhere in upstate New York, but and because of that, now the policy has changed. Whereas in the past, the Republicans were drill baby drill, and the Democrats were all green. It's shifted. I mean, the Obama administration believes deeply in the natural gas part of this, and the oil comes along as a result of this. I don't know if you saw the Keystone XL pipeline from Canada that was supposed to come down, that got canceled temporarily. The Obama administration doesn't want to shut that thing down. Yes, he was worried about his political left flank, and because of the way the politics and bureaucracy works, he was able to kind of get a political victory by shutting it down temporarily, but everybody knows it's coming, right? If he gets reelected, that pipeline is coming. Right? And there's 100 reasons from an oil perspective why you want that pipeline. It does make a lot of sense. And even from an environmental perspective, it actually, as a net benefit, net gain issue, it does make sense. But of course, a lot of environmental groups think in absolute terms. But they've been severely weakened by the fact that this has happened during the recession. There's a lot more support from the Democrats, and it's always been from the Republicans.
Do you think there's a strategy to dissuade Iran from getting a bomb? And if not, how do you back down without losing too much face?
I think there is a strategy to tell the Iranians they should get a bomb. If I wanted to design a policy that said, hey, Iran, you should get a nuclear weapon, it would be this one that Washington is running right now. You're basically telling them, we're going to crush you, right? And if you're that case, you're looking and saying, okay, let's see, let's look at Iraq and let's look at North Korea. Which one, as a regime, is safer today? It's North Korea, and they got the bomb. So again, I think the only way you can really solve this issue is you have to look at the Israelis. And you have to therefore think about the entire regional geostrategic picture, right? How can you create a situation where you can balance that power imbalance I talked about before? You've got to find a way to say, look, this is not a zero-sum game. The problem is U.S. domestic politics simply don't allow that. You cannot put these two on the same table. If you dare suggest that the Israeli nuclear bomb is as dangerous as the Iranian bomb, forget it. There's no place for it in Washington. And that's the problem. That's what you need to do. You need to discuss it as a whole. You cannot do that. So how do you back down from that? That's why I think they're not back down. I think we're going to have to come.
So, a couple questions if I may.
Maybe I could, since you asked.
Yeah,
I could pop
I
back.
I have two questions. You can choose to answer either one. Both are kind of, is there any way that the U.S. will ever moderate its position on the Palestinians, which is intractable and unsupportable? And secondly, how about hydrofracking? Is there any way to mitigate the concerns that are raised so aggressively with that.
Regarding the Palestinians, the United States will be the last country in the world to change its policy in the right way. And my personal belief is that the Israeli state is going to collapse in the same way apartheid South Africa did. And the U.S. will be the last ones to get on board with that change. When it becomes a single state, it will be the last. So my view is we will continue to play a very poisonous role there. We already have, but we will continue to drag out the pain for everybody. So pessimistic view from the U.S., but I do think changes are occurring. And everybody sort of predicts it's intractable, this, that, and the other. Well, everyone thought the whole Middle East was in this stagnant position for years and years. There's a tipping point. When you see the problems lined up, you hit a tipping point and things change drastically. Right? And I've done enough oil forecasts to know that everybody forecasts an average thing. It kind of looks like today with a little bit of change, and then your forecasts change all the time. It's the same thing with these politics, right? That's not how it's going to play out. There will come a point where things change drastically. On the fracking, I don't know enough about the technology, to be honest, to know. Again, I think given the changes this is causing economically, given the time that it's occurred in, I think you're going to find that what you'll get is, relatively speaking, a little more with the Democrats, a little bit less with the Republicans. You'll get the EPA involved more. You'll try to mitigate these issues, but I think it's going to be difficult. Actually, there was a headline that came across today, which I just found shocking, because if this would have happened again 5 years ago, it would have been a scandal and would have shut all this stuff down. There was a headline that came across, I think it was the U.S. Geological Service, saying only 1% of fracking wells cause earthquakes. Only 1%, and there's tens of thousands of them, which is just astounding to me that you could just brush that off. Oh, it's just 1%.
It's much more than earthquakes.
Yeah, well, and flaming tap water. So, you're going to have to find. First of all, cash will mitigate a lot of that, right? Somebody gets their water destroyed, but they get a big enough royalty, fine, I'm out of here. That'll mitigate a lot of it, and then EPA will come in and there'll be various levels of regulation. It seems to me you'd need like a Fukushima-style disaster to really change that. Even that, who knows?
I have a question just kind of piggybacking on his first one. This is something that I really don't know much about, and I'm like trying to understand like everything that you've been saying, but my question is if the U.S.'s policy in Israel is so caustic, why isn't there somebody or some group, or why are they sticking with it? Why don't they change something? I just don't understand.
Yeah. There's a really good book you should read. I think it's a 20-year-old book now, called Perceptions of Palestine. The author is Kathleen Christensen, I think, if I remember her name right. She's an ex-CIA analyst. And she goes through the entire relationship. And it's very interesting because she doesn't look at this as Israeli-Palestinian conflict. She looks at it as a three-way triangle. Israelis, Palestinians, Americans. And she goes through the whole conflict going back about 100 years, just sort of 30, 40, 50, 60. And she goes at U.S. administration by U.S. administration, showing the ideology, the relationship to Zionism, how that impacted domestic politics. And when you really come down to it, it is an ideological relationship, right? And it has its base in these notions of Christian Zionism and return and all these things. And that's why a lot of people talk of AIPAC and the lobby there, and you have a hard time even saying the Israel lobby like Walton Mersheimer, it's hard to even broach the subject because of that. And because AIPAC is so powerful as far as election and campaign financing. But the core of it, I think, is much deeper. It's not really at that level. The core of it is really Christian conservatives. Right? And that, obviously we're seeing in sort of Republican primaries in the South how important that vote is. But that's a large plurality.